Today, because it's the last Shara of the year, I decided we're going to do two for the price of one. We'll do two Mishnahs. And the truth is that most of the layouts, because remember, in Pirkei Avos, sometimes a Mishnah is split and sometimes it is not. In this particular occasion, it just makes logical sense to put these two Mishnahs together. So we're in Pirkei chapter 4, and these are Mishnayos Zayin and Ches, 7 and 8. Both attributed to the same person and on the same theme, and that's why it makes sense to study them both together. Okay, so we'll start with just a revision test. Can I do that? Which rabbi was the author of the previous Mishnah? Does anybody remember? The author of the previous Mishnah was Rabbi Yossi. Now, the only reason I mention that is because there's an interesting debate between all the classical commentaries on Pirkei Avos about what decides the order in which the Mishnayos appear. It's quite interesting. So the truth is, as we often say, Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chayim, which means to say that it's not that the one is correct and therefore the other one is inaccurate. They're both correct. They're both valid. So there are two systems that we use to create the chronology, the flow of the Mishnayos. The one is chronology. And very often you'll see in Pirkei Avos that a particular rabbi is quoted after their father or after their teacher, because that's logical, right? That's the flow. The other system that we use is contextual. So whatever we were talking about in the previous Mishnah, we'll find a topic that leads on from that Mishnah. So in this particular case, we've got both. Because the Mishnah begins by telling us, Rabbi Yishmael benoi oimer. So that's clear. Rabbi Yishmael, his son. That's why you have to know who's the rabbi of the previous Mishnah. Whose son is this? So Rabbi Yishmael, the son of Rabbi Yossi. It's important for us to know because there were a number of different Rabbi Yishmaels at different periods in time. So Rabbi Yishmael, the son of Rabbi Yossi, teaches this Mishnah. But at the same time, he also continues the message of the previous Mishnah. So what was the message of the previous Mishnah? Was the theme of not desecrating Hashem's name. In fact, it was the theme of the last two Mishnayos. Was not to desecrate Hashem's name and not to use the Torah for personal gain and not to use the Torah as a means of earning a living. So that was the theme. And we ended off in the previous Mishnah that if a person desecrates the Torah, God forbid, it's going to lead to themselves being, denigrated by people. Okay, that's where we left off last Mishnah. So we're carrying on this theme. And as I said, the author of this Mishnah is Rabbi Yishmael, the son of Rabbi Yossi. Now, if you remember, Rabbi Yossi was exiled. He landed up going to a place called Tzipori. And the reason was because he spoke out against the Roman government, and obviously they didn't like that, so they sent him packing. And he landed up in Tzipori, where Rabbi Yishmael, his son, took over as the next rabbi. So there's direct continuation, historical chronology over here about after Rabbi Yossi, so Rabbi Yishmael is the next rabbi of Tzipori. Now, why is that relevant to us? Why do we have to know where he is? So there are a few things that are relevant about this. First of all, what's relevant is we're now edging closer to the end of the period of the Tanoim. To the beginning of Pirkei Avos, we spoke right at the beginning of Shimon HaTzadik. Shimon HaTzadik was from the last of the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, which is the beginning of the Mishnaic period. And then we went through such famous people like Hillel and Shammai, who were very early on. Of course, not the earliest, because their teachers were taught by their teacher all the way to Shimon HaTzadik, but they were earlier on. And now we're edging towards the end, historically, of the Mishnaic period. So Rabbi Yishmael had a colleague who was younger than himself, but he gave this colleague a tremendous amount of respect. This colleague's name was Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. So Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, as we know, is the person who puts together the Mishnayos. He is the compiler of Mishnah. And it's important for us to know that Rabbi Yishmael, even though he was older than Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, he gave him a huge amount of respect, and he assisted Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi in the process of compiling the Mishnah. So that's interesting for us to know. What's also interesting for us to know is that Rabbi Yishmael himself obviously was considered to be a very great scholar, obviously, but more interestingly, he was considered to be a person of the most impeccable honesty. Now, honesty it's stock in trade for every rabbi, right? Certainly of that time, you expect that they were honest people. But Rabbi Yishmael had this unusual degree of honesty, and the Gemara tells us a story to illustrate it. Now, we're not an agricultural community, so before we can even start the story, we need a little bit of context, because, let's be honest, when you drive wherever it is, I don't know, that's coming for the summer holidays and maybe you're going to go somewhere, maybe you'll drive a bit of a distance. So you know, one of the beautiful things about driving outside of the cities, you see fields, right? So for us, we don't know what's in those fields. We just see things. We don't know if it's corn, if it's wheat, we don't know. If it's sunflowers, we kind of work it out because they're pretty obvious. So the agricultural world is a little bit foreign to us, and so that's why we need a bit of background to the story. In those days, there was something called an oris. Ever heard of an oris? No. Oris was a person, they had a deal, and the deal was, let's say I owned a whole big piece of land, but I didn't want to have the dirty work of actually working the land, so I have two choices. Either I could hire laborers, and they'd work the fields, and they get paid a salary, or I can enter into a deal which is called the oris deal, which basically says, you'll be my oris. That means you'll do the work, and instead of taking a salary, you'll get a portion of the produce. So in English, they call it a sharecropper. So that's how it works, right? You share the crops. So Rabbi Yishmael had this large field, and he had this oris who worked for him. And the deal was that whenever it was the harvest season, or even if it wasn't the harvest season, I assume that the oris took care of things even after the harvest season. So once a week, he'd bring fresh grain to Rabbi Yishmael so that he could prepare for Shabbos. And he'd always bring, because it was for Shabbos, he'd always bring the grain on a Friday. One day, the oris arrives on Thursday. Okay, let's pause for a second. What do you think? What do you think if you've got somebody who's got a regular schedule and now they're ahead of schedule? What do you think?
Hang on.
I don't know. I think, great. This is fantastic. No, it's amazing. They're ahead of schedule. Rabbi Shmuel straight away says, something's up. Something's not so kosher over here. Can you imagine? Something not so kosher. So then, this oris says to Rabbi Shmuel, just by the way, tomorrow I have a court case and you're one of the presiding judges. So he says, hang on a second. So you brought the produce earlier, you've done me a favor, I recuse myself from the case. Not willing to judge. Because you've now bribed me. He says, what do you mean I bribed you? It's just practical. I've got a court case tomorrow. I brought you the produce today. He says, forget about it. You did something that is in my interest, something that's a benefit to me, not willing to be the judge in your case. And so he removed himself from the bench, but he went along to watch the proceedings anyway. And this is the interesting part of the story, because Rabbi Shmuel says, as he was watching the arguments unfold, he found his mind consistently finding reasons to support the oris. So he says, you see, that's what it means when the Torah says, Ki hashoichad ya'aver pikchim, that the nature of bribery is that it blinds the wise. Look at that. I didn't even, firstly, I didn't sit on the bench. Secondly, I didn't ask for the bribe. Thirdly, I didn't take it as a bribe. And yet, it still colored my view of the story. Fascinating. So that tells you the impeccable character of Rabbi Yishmael Rabbi Yossi. Now, this is going to be relevant to our conversation because this Mishnah, or these two Mishnayos, are all about judges. So it's valuable to know who's talking. Who's talking is a person whose attitude towards being a judge is an incredible attitude, number one. Number two, we're coming on the back of Rabbi Yossi in the previous Mishnah talking about not desecrating the Torah. And what Rabbi Yishmael is effectively telling us is that if a person is not a judge as they should be, if a person doesn't have that high level of integrity, that is one of the ways, God forbid, somebody could desecrate the Torah. So can you see the flow now from the previous Mishnah to this Mishnah? So listen to what Rabbi Yishmael Benoi Oimer, what Rabbi Yishmael says. He says as follows.
Sorry, I'm a bit confused. Who was at the court case?
Rabbi Yishmael was the one who was invited to be the judge and turned it down. Okay? So, Rabbi Yishmael teaches as follows. Ha-choseich atzmoi min hadin. Now, it's slightly ambiguous what he's saying, but we'll take it at face value. Ha-choseich atzmoi min hadin. A person who withholds themselves from judgment, poireik mimenu, removes from themselves eva, hatred, vegezel, and theft, ushvuas shav, and meaningless oaths. Okay, so what's he saying? A person who removes themselves from judgment. Poirek mimenu alleviates from their life three things: Eva, hatred; Gezel, theft; Ushvuas, shov, and fake oaths. That's the one side of the extreme. And the other side of the extreme is Vehagas liboy behoira'ah, a person who is arrogant when they share hoira'ah, which is halachic rulings. Such a person is shoite, a fool; rasha, wicked; vegas ruach, which literally translates as arrogant. Okay, that's the first Mishnah. We'll get to the second Mishnah shortly. That's the first Mishnah. So let's understand what's his message. First of all, let me ask the question this way: how many people over here are on the process, on the path to becoming a judge? No. Not happening, right? It's not happening. So why do we have to learn this Mishnah? Take this Mishnah to the Constitutional Court. You know, why is it relevant to us? So that's one of the things that we'll have to examine. But first we've got to ask ourselves the question: if a person avoids judgment, who do you think he's talking to? In other words, there's a population, in the average population, the vast majority of people are not in the legal profession. Out of those people who are in the legal profession, the vast majority of them are never going to be judges. So what population is he addressing over here when he says, a person who withholds themselves from judgment? He must be talking to somebody who could be a judge. Right? Otherwise, why are you having this conversation? You don't have to warn me not to be a judge. I'm not planning to be a judge. You don't have to tell me. So he must be talking clearly to people who are suitable to be judges, which only raises the question in the other direction. If they're suitable to be judges, why advise them not to? You see the question over here doesn't seem to make sense. Who exactly are you talking to? If you're talking to somebody who should not be on the bench, don't tell them. Tell the other people who the selection committee. Don't take that guy because he's not suitable. And if somebody is suitable, why on earth is the advice? Take yourself away from judgment. It's an interesting question. And so we've got to understand that in this question, there are layers. Because on the one hand, it's obviously practical advice that we have to apply to somebody. And on the other hand, it's obviously also telling us a message over here about the attitude that a judge should take when you are a judge. So, doesn't mean if a person is qualified to be a judge, they should not be a judge. It means if you're qualified to be a judge, you shouldn't always look to judge. What does that mean? So the Gemara in Sanhedrin talks about this in a lot of detail. And it's brought in halacha as well. The Rambam brings it. Whenever you have a choice between going to court and settling out of court, we'll always encourage to settle out of court. So the Gemara talks about this. We call it the concept of Shara, which is compromise. That it's always better to, instead of, some people always like to litigate. That's how they are. Some people are that way. You do this wrong to them and there you go. You've got a lawyer's letter. It is one way. You can be litigious. It's one way to live your life. It's not necessarily a great way to live your life. And other people are, let's work it through. Let's talk. Let's get somebody, a mediator who can hear both sides, who can take us through the process. So mediation is absolutely the favored approach in Torah, halachically. People don't realize this. Even though we believe absolutely in the principle of a court system and in the principle of judges, we still prioritize and prefer mediation over judgment. That's what he's saying. If you're a judge and a case comes before you and you pull away from saying, okay, fine, I'll take it on, and instead of that you advise people to mediate, that's a great attitude. Why is that a great attitude? Because he's going to tell us something which unfortunately is the reality of our lives. It always gets ugly. The moment you go the legal route, it is absolutely guaranteed someone is going to get hurt. So that's what the Torah says. Let's rather avoid that as much as we possibly can. Let's try and find a mediation. Now, when it comes to court cases, what are we actually concerned about? We're concerned about three things. Ava, Gezel, and Shavuas Shav. Hatred, theft, and inappropriate oaths. Let's understand. Hatred where? Where's the hatred going to come? Who has to worry about hatred in the court system? The judge. The judge, right? Because whatever conclusion you will reach, someone's going to be upset at you. So that's what Rabbi Yishmael says. If you avoid judgment, you remove from yourself hatred. People are not going to hate you. You could be the best judge in the whole world. Judges are not people's friends in their professional life, right? There's always going to be somebody who's not happy with the outcome. Whereas if you go the mediation route, you've allowed people the opportunity to speak, to share, to voice their opinions, to feel heard. Great. That's amazing. That allows you the opportunity that you could come to a conclusion and nobody necessarily hates you. You also run the risk of gezel. How could there be theft in the story if you're a judge? How could there be theft? So why is that theft? Your name? Okay, but that's not unique to a judge, right? That wouldn't be unique to a judge. So here's the thing. The principle is ein ledayon elo ma she'ein of ro'os. You can only judge with the evidence that is presented to you, and the unfortunate reality is that sometimes the evidence is either misrepresented or simply missing. And that's the sad reality sometimes, is that a person is in the right, but they don't have the means to prove it. Now, you're a judge. Once the case comes to you and you're sitting presiding over this case, you have no escape. You now are required, according to Torah, to see the process through, and you can only rely on the evidence that is presented to you. And the unfortunate reality is either there are malicious people involved who will misrepresent, or it's possible that there just simply isn't evidence that you need. Which means that it is always possible that a judge could, with all good intentions, still arrive at the wrong conclusion. And then what happens if you do? So what happens if the judge now decides that Mr. A has to pay Mr. B, and that wasn't the facts of the case, it's only what he had based on the information presented? He has technically now sanctioned theft. Money that's gone to somebody who should not have gotten that money. So stay away from the courts, stay away from the process of being a judge, and you have a higher chance of avoiding gezel, taking money inappropriately from one person to the next. And the worst part, unfortunately, about the judicial process is that people have to testify under oath. And to testify under oath is, now you'll notice, if you're familiar, because not everybody's necessarily familiar with this, but the term that's used over here is shavuas shav. So you might be familiar with the fact that there are various kinds of false or inappropriate oaths that a person could take. So let's just analyze that for a second and you understand exactly what the Mishnah is saying over here. There's something called shavuas sheker. What's a shavuas sheker? What does sheker mean? False, right? A lie, right? So what's shavuas sheker? Let's try and see if we can come up with an example between us of a shavuas sheker where a person takes a false oath. Can you give me an example of a false oath? Now the reason I'm asking the question is dafka, because very often people just assume that it all is the same, and it's not. So what's an example of a false oath?
You could say, I wasn't at the scene of the crime, I was on holiday.
Correct, exactly. There's a false oath. I swear I was not there at the time. And then evidence emerges that you were. So that would be a false oath. The person said X, and actually Y was true. That's a false oath. What is a shavuas shav? This is fascinating. What is a shavuas shav? The direct translation is an oath in vain. What would be a shavuas shav? It's not the same as a lie. A lie is malicious. A lie is, I was there, but actually I wasn't. Or, this is what happened, it's actually not what happened. Shavuas shav, a vain oath, is what? Any idea? Any idea of an example? It doesn't make a difference. If it's not true, then to swear that it didn't happen is shavuas sheker. That's a false oath. So what's a Shavuos Shav? Listen to this for an example. If somebody had to right now get up and say it is night time outside, and they swear that it's night time outside, we would say that is a Shavuos Shav. It's not sheker, it's not false. False means we don't know the truth, and you're testifying to the truth, and you're testifying falsely. This is nonsense, because we can look out the window. We don't need testimony. We don't need witnesses. We look out the window, we see the blue sky, we know that it's day. So that person who gets up and swears that it's night is talking nonsense. Now, why would a person do that? Why would a person take this nonsensical oath?
Because then, I don't know, I'm just guessing, maybe it could say, well, it's not of the right mind.
Okay, to plead insanity, right? Yeah. To plead insanity, I'm shugana. Or they could say, you see how careful I am with my word. I'm even willing to swear, like some kind of convoluted, strange way to try and present themselves as if they're an honest person. Okay, it's weird. We don't expect the normal population to do this. Now let's flip it around. What would happen if somebody stood up now in front of this room and said that they swear that it is daytime outside? What is that? It's not Shavuos Sheker, right? It's not a false oath because it's factually correct. So what is it? That is also Shavuos Shav. So why on earth are you wasting an oath, which is a very serious thing to do, on a fact that is obvious? That's the concern in the legal process. The legal process puts people under pressure. When people are under pressure, they feel perhaps you're not going to believe what I'm saying, and that will promote them to swear about things that actually don't need an oath. So if you stay away from the legal process, even if you're a judge and you're qualified to do so, you avoid putting people into a position where they will probably swear about things they didn't have to swear about. Now, do you remember right at the end of the first chapter of Pirkei Avos? Do you remember that? Do you remember the very end of the first chapter of Pirkei Avos? What did it say there? It said, Al shloisha devarim ha'olam kayam. The world is established or sustained by three things. What were the three things? Now, everybody knows the other Mishnah earlier on in Pirkei Avos that says that the world stands on three things. That we all know, Torah, Avodah, Gemilus, Chasodim. But this is at the end of the first chapter. We say that the world is sustained by three things. What are the three things? Anybody remember? Emes, Mishpat, Shalom. Those are the three things. Truth, justice, and peace. Now the litigious community, people who always love to sue and bring a lawyer's letter and go the legal route, they believe that the world is sustained on mishpat, on justice alone. And they'll quote for you, as all the great open-minded Westerners like to quote, Tzedek, tzedek, tirdoif. Justice, justice shall you pursue, which has got to be one of the most abused phrases out of the whole of the Torah. Because whenever people say justice should be pursued, effectively what they're saying is my agenda should be pursued. But anyhow, so the person who believes that the whole world stands on justice, the world cannot stand on a single pillar, just like anything else in the physical reality, cannot balance on a single leg. There has to be this tripartite alliance, as we call it in this country. Right? There has to be this reality of three different dynamics that work together. So the person who's qualified as a judge, you know how it is. Do you remember when you got your driver's license? What happens when you get your driver's license? All you want to do is be in the car the whole day, which is great for parents. For the first few weeks of a driver's license, somebody can do all the errands. When you first become a judge, what do you want to do? Judge cases. I've worked so hard, I've qualified, that's what I want to do. I'm going to judge cases. Right? So you think that the whole world revolves around mishpat, or din, around justice. Comes along Rabbi Shmuel and he says, if a person is able, as a judge, as somebody who's qualified to sit in that position, if you're able to move yourself away from an attitude that believes that justice is the sole foundation of the whole of society and the whole of life, then you'll be healthy. Because if you don't, if you think it's only about justice, you forget about peace and you forget about truth. And that's exactly what he says in the three examples that he gives. The person who is completely fixated on justice draws negative attention to themselves, Ava. Nobody likes a person who only sees things through the lens of justice. We like people who can be a bit malleable. We like people who can tolerate a little bit of error, you know. So we don't enjoy the person who's always judging everybody else. And by the way, that's one of the reasons that in the next piece he says such a person is a shoiter, is a fool, because people think the prestige of being a judge is going to attract people to them. Actually, it's going to alienate them from people, because nobody wants, you know, can you imagine every single time you sit down to a Shabbos meal and there they go telling you exactly by the book every single scenario. Do me a favor, let us just enjoy ourselves, you know. Have to hear every scenario, exactly how it works in this commercial law and international law. Just, you know, it's okay. It's just the parasha of the week. So nobody got hurt. So, second of all, the goal is to balance the world, not just on justice, but also on peace. So that's why he says, if you only go the justice route, you'll end up creating ava, you'll end up creating anger and hatred between people. And gezel, theft, which is a lack of justice. And you'll end up creating shvuah shav, which is a lack of truth. Because if it's an overly litigated reality, people start saying things to protect themselves that they shouldn't say. So that's actually his message. It's a throwback to the Mishnah that we learned from Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, the Mishnah that says that Torah takes a balanced approach to life. Don't get totally caught up in a single path and then think that that single path is going to keep the whole of Judaism alive. Ah, great. And that's the second Mishnah that we're going to learn today. So hold that thought. Brilliant. Okay, hold that thought. We'll come to that in a second. Let's just talk for a second. He says, Hagas liboy behoira'a. That's the next point. So the first point was speaking about a judge. And then the second point was Hagas liboy behoira'a. A person who is, so to speak, self-assured in hoira'ah, in rendering halachic decisions. So the first was talking about a judge, which is really specific, because a judge obviously is a person in the court system, whereas hoira'ah could mean just a rabbi in a community whose responsibility is to decide, you know, do you have to throw out the pot or you don't have to throw out the pot, you know that. So gas liboy behoira'ah means when a person becomes self-assured in their rendering of halacha, that's when they are shoiter rasha v'gas ruach. That's a foolish attitude, and it's a wicked attitude, and it's a person who becomes gas ruach. Now, the normal translation of gas ruach is arrogant. But there's another translation as well. Gas means something which has become thickened. So, for example, you talk about animals, you talk about a behema gasa and a behema daka. So a gasa is a large animal like a bull, and a daka is a more petite animal like a sheep. So, gas means that a person's become crass. So if a person is gas liboy b'hoira'ah, if they're arrogant and self-assured in their rendering of halachic decisions, eventually they become gas ruach. They actually become an insensitive person. And I'm sure we'll know this from our own experience, because one thing we know, I think, is that those individuals in our communities who are the moirei hoira'ah, who are the poiskim, who are the people who actually render halachic decisions, the reason we keep going back to them to get the halacha from them is dafka because of how approachable they are, and because of how in touch with human experience they are, and because of the fact that they don't just fob us off and give us some kind of a quoted answer. It's the fact that they get their hands dirty, like the Gemara says about David HaMelech, that he literally got his hands dirty examining the shaylas that were brought to him. So those are the people that everybody goes to. It's not a matter of how smart you are, how much halacha you know, how quickly you can quote, how many sources you could quote. At the end of the day, it is the person who's not gas-slave, the person who is not self-assured and dismissive and parochial in their approach. That's ultimately who the poskim are. And I think this will be true across the board. We'll all know that from our own experience. And people who are outside of the religious community, they look at us and say, you know, how do you take such delicate parts of your life to these rabbis? And say, well, I guarantee you, you don't have somebody in your life who is that personable and that approachable and that in touch. And people are always, they're mind blown by how our poskim are able to relate to real life scenarios and really assist people in a real life manner. That's from this Mishnah. And how do you achieve that? How does a person ensure that they don't get carried away and overly confident with their halachic prowess? So there are two things. First is practical and the second is philosophical. The practical is this. They say that the Chassam Sofer, who was one of obviously the greatest sages in the last couple of centuries, never rendered an halachic decision without consulting a book first. You understand what that means? You go and you ask one of those simple basic questions. I open up the milchik drawer and inside was a fleishik spoon. Everybody knows what to do, right? He wouldn't render a halachic decision without consulting a sefer. I'll tell you a story that I heard about a contemporary rabbi. I mean, he's no longer alive, but a contemporary rabbi. This story is mind-blowing. This happened in the last few decades. And a family member phoned him. He was away from home. A family member phoned him from the house with an halachic question. From his own house. They phoned this rabbi. The rabbi was not home. He was wherever he was. And they phoned him from his own home with this particular question. And they wanted to know what's the halachic ruling. It was a very straightforward, I think it was kashrus, straightforward question. He said, I'm afraid I can't answer. I'm not home. I don't have my sfarim. They said, but it's really a straightforward question, you know, yes or no. And there's some pressure at home. Maybe it was preparation of food, whatever it was. Straightforward. He says, I'm not home. I don't have my sfarim. I cannot answer the question. And because it was a family member, obviously they could apply more pressure. And they said, we need an answer. You have to give us an answer now. So he said, fine. Go to my study. Go to this shelf. On this shelf, the fourth book from the right, take it off the shelf. Okay, so they go, they take the book off the shelf. It says, open to page X. They open to page X. It says, go down to the third paragraph. Go to the third paragraph. Read what it says over there. They read the answer, said that answer. So, what's the point of this, right? What's the point? The point was to illustrate clearly that you don't just rely on knowledge and paskin a shaila. You have to ensure 100% the humility of saying it's not me who's answering the shaila, there is a source. To me, it's one of these landmark stories that should impress upon us, you know, what it is to answer an halachic question. Which brings us to the philosophy of it. The philosophy is this. You know, the Gemara tells us that there's a verse about David HaMelech that says, V'Hashem imoy. Hashem was with him. So the Gemara asked the question, what do you mean Hashem is with David HaMelech? Was Hashem not with Moshe Rabbeinu? Was Hashem, you know, why does it say Hashem was with him? And the Gemara says, V'Hashem imoy shehalocha kamoisoi. That when it means that when it says that Hashem is with him, it means that whenever there was a debate, because David HaMelech sat on the Sanhedrin, whenever there was a debate, the halacha was always found to be like his view, like his opinion. Fascinating, right? So what does that mean? V'Hashem imoy, what does it mean? What does it mean he was cleverer than everybody else? Does it mean they all deferred to him because he was the king? No, the pasuk says V'Hashem imoy, because Hashem was with him. Because there are two ways that a person could learn Torah, the appropriate way and the not appropriate way. The not appropriate way is to say, I'm a smart person. And there's so much wisdom in the Torah. Thank God I'm smart enough. I can chap the wisdom. And then you could, God forbid, forget about Hashem. Like the Gemara tells us about the generation at the time of the Churban. It says, what happened to that generation? Harbe lamdu Torah. Many people studied Torah. V'shachachu al noisei na Torah. And they forgot about the giver of the Torah. Can you imagine such a thing? How could you learn Torah and forget about Hashem? And the Gemara says, you know how? Because they didn't say the bracha before they learned every single morning. The bracha, or lasik b'divrei Torah, different opinions, right? They never said the bracha, which means to say that it is possible for a person to study Torah and think that it's all just about intellect and wisdom. So therefore, Hashem imoy, because King David learned Torah in such a way that he always felt Hashem with him. In other words, he was always acutely aware of the fact that this is divine wisdom. And divine wisdom is infinite. And I'm a finite being. I might be the most brilliant human, but I'm still a finite being. I can never ensure that I chap it. Therefore, I know that I have to be humble enough to always invite Hashem into the space. And that's what Rabbi Yishmael is telling us over here. When a person becomes overconfident in ruling halacha, that's when they're going to be foolish enough to make terrible mistakes. Following directly from that, the next Mishnah, Hu Haya Omer, he used to say as follows: Al Tehi Don Yechidi. Don't be an individual judge. She'ein don yechidi elo echad. Because there is no single judge except for one. Okay, nice play on words, right? Echad obviously referring to Hashem Echad. And then he says, V'al toimar kablu daiti, and don't ever insist that people should accept your opinion, shehein reshoim v'loi ato, because that's their prerogative, not yours. What's he telling us? Only Hashem can truly judge. That's what he's telling us. Ein don yechidi elo echad. There's only one entity that can judge alone, without input, without consultation, without looking in a sefer, without only one. And that's Hashem himself. But we're human beings. We always have to consult. We always have to look up a sefer. We always have to remain humble. Never stand with that kind of self-assurance to say, I know. So that's obviously the link between these two Mishnayos. But here's an interesting thing. You see, he says, there's only one judge who can judge alone. Ein don yechidi. There's only one who can judge alone. Echad. What's he saying? He's telling us the fundamental difference between Hashem and everything and everyone else. We are not echad. That means to say, as the cliche goes, no man is an island. We are not echad. We are not self-sufficient. We rely on an ecosystem. It takes a village to raise a child, right? We rely on interaction. We rely on other people. And that has to be the most important guiding light for how we are as leaders, as teachers, as judges, as poskim, to recognize we don't have the capacity to stand off from everybody else in some kind of an abstract way and kind of wag a finger at them and dictate to them how things should be, because we're enmeshed in the same reality, in the same society. And that goes back really to the point of a posek, that a posek has to not just read you the law, they have to understand you. That's what always distinguishes a true posek, is how well they understand who they're speaking to. It's quite funny. I mean, it's a bit of a stretch to make this comparison, but it is funny. Many years ago, when Facebook was still somewhat moral, so at that point, I joined Facebook. And there was a guy here in the community who said it would be a great idea to have a group on Facebook called Ask the Rabbi. So I said, yeah, that is a great idea. So he said, fine, you'll be the rabbi. So we started this group. He started this group and he appointed me the rabbi in this Ask the Rabbi group, which is very interesting. It's very interesting. I've had to change it a few times. Now it's got to be a private group because otherwise you get all Meshugoyim. Now we only get some Meshugoyim. So it's like a very interesting space. And what's interesting about it is it was called Ask the Rabbi. But then a whole lot of rabbis joined and decided that they wanted to be the rabbi. Which is fine. I mean, I don't mind. If you want to answer a question, answer a question. It's only one big deal. I know most of the people on the group because it's mostly a local group. And so some of the answers that some of the other people were putting onto the group were not relevant to the people who are asking. That's the advantage. When you know who you're dealing with, you have a sense of where they're holding. You have a sense of what they can handle, what they can't handle. You have a sense of the local topography. You know what you're dealing with. And to me that was fascinating because that's exactly the message of any posek, of any teacher. You have to know your crowd. Ein don yechidi elo echad. Only Hashem has the bird's eye view to be able to look at things with absolute objectivity and absolute truth and say, Azoi, this is the way it has to be. So it's quite a powerful lesson for us. Ein don yechidi elo echad. The take-home message, obviously, from this entire Mishnah is, if that's how we speak to a judge, somebody who is qualified, if that's how we speak to a posek, somebody who has a repository of knowledge, and these are the things we're telling them, don't rush to judge, don't decide halachic opinion from a position of self-assuredness. So what's the message then to the rest of us? If a judge is supposed to try and avoid judgment, so if I'm not a judge, how important then is it that I should avoid judgment, certainly of other people, even though it is a human default setting, that we tend to judge people, as we do, right? Like, I'll admit, I was driving yesterday and I judged the guy next to me because he was on his phone and talking with his hands at 100 kilometers an hour. So I I really just judged the distance from my car because he was kind of veering into my lane. But, you know, that we do. We judge people. That is our default setting, and that's what this mission is teaching us. If a judge is advised to avoid judgment, kol shekain, how much more so us, we should be looking for emes and shalom. And if a poisek, somebody who really knows halacha, is told, don't be gas liboy b'hoira'ah, don't be so self-assured when you decide for somebody else what the halachic circumstances are, how much more so us, we're not poiskim. And how often do we do that? We say, no, I don't think you should do this, or yes, this is exactly how it has to be, and we start dishing out halachic advice to people without even batting an eyelid. So it's really good, it's good information and good lessons for us. There's another good lesson as well. There's only one who can judge without consultation, and that's Hashem. That includes when we try and judge ourselves. Because a big part of the honesty of Judaism is introspection. Not only once a year, in the run-up to Yom Kippur, where everybody gets all nervous and starts to do these self-assessments. We're supposed to be doing it all the time, right? So we're consistently supposed to test, how am I doing, how's my learning, how's my davening, how's my growth, how's my Avas Yisrael, how's my tzedakah, all these various things. So, Ein dan yechidi elo echad. The Gemara tells us that Karoiv pasul le'edus, that a relative cannot testify against a relative, not for the good and not for the bad. Because the nature of relatives is once you're so close, you actually can't see things for what they are. And that, by extension, is this whole Mishnah, because we're all kind of close. We all have a bias. And that's why Rabbi Yishmael is the one to teach us, because right at the beginning, he warned us about his life story, warned us against bias. But we all have a bias, because we're all somewhat close to the story. But the closest of all is our own story. And that's why there's an expression that says, Adam koroiv eitzel atzmoi. That just as a person cannot testify against a relative, you cannot testify against yourself, because you are your own closest relative. Or to paraphrase an expression, there's a beautiful expression about the laws of tzaras that says, Kol hanegoim roi'e adam chutz min nigei atzmoi, which means that if a person is the expert at identifying the different rashes that indicate either tzaras or not, they could check anybody except themselves. So the paraphrase of that is, anybody can see any blemish except their own. That's the funny thing. We're very poor at self-assessment. Ein dan yechidi, when you're alone, yechidi on your own. Ein dan yechidi, don't judge yourself alone. Elo echad, because only Hashem is capable of doing that. So even in a personal self-assessment, it's always valuable, as we learned again in the first chapter, asay lo chorav, that a person should have some kind of a mentor, some kind of a guide, some independent, trustworthy, learned, exemplary human being who you can actually go to from time to time and say, help me judge myself. Because when we try to judge ourselves on our own, unfortunately, we very often land up either too harsh or more likely too easy.